Hello, everybody. It is with great sadness I come to y'all today. For I've just learned of the passing of the great Irish accordion player and whistle player, the great Joe Burke. I just learned of this very short while ago. He passed at the age of 81 over in Ireland. I was blessed, and I stress the word blessed, to have been living in St. Louis, Missouri during the years that Joe lived there. Joe lived in St. Louis with his wife, Anne Conroy, who was herself a marvelous and mighty accordionist. For a period of time, Joe was managing the bookings for Irish bands and Irish musicians at one of the greatest Irish pubs in the country, which is called McGurk's in near downtown St. Louis, in a very, very old historical district called Soulard. Many of the buildings are made of old, very, very old red brick and date back to the middle 1800s in many cases. I can't count the number of fine evenings that I went to McGurk's to drink a pint or two, or even 3 or 4. To hear Joe play. Many of those times he was playing with the great Ilian Piper, the great Piper Cooney, Michael Piper Cooney, as well as with Terry Corcoran, the great singer, guitar player Terry Corcoran, who was living near St. Louis for many years with his wife. There's a fantastic record, a CD record, with Joe Burke, Piper Cooney, and Terry Corcoran. Easily searchable if you're into that kind of stuff. I have a copy somewhere around the house here. But many of those nights, one could find Joe and Michael Cooney and Terry Corcoran playing 3 long sets, usually, throughout the course of a long evening. We're talking about the late 1980s, the early 1990s, right around in there, right around in that period. Some of the greats from Ireland would come over. You'd scarcely believe it now, but I could walk in to McGurk's on a Wednesday night, some random Wednesday night. I could walk into McGurk's and find myself listening for 3 solid hours to Martin Hayes play the fiddle in a small, intimate room with a backup player or two. Another one of the great accordion players of Ireland that Joe Burke brought in was Jackie Daly. He brought in Noel Shine and Mary Green. Marvelous players. Mary Green is a marvelous singer. Marvelous, absolutely marvelous voice. And my old buddy Noel Shine played guitar and sang quite beautifully himself. I remember nights walking into McGurk's in the early 90s and being able to sit and listen to an entire evening of Kevin Burke, the great fiddler Kevin Burke. In fact, one of my fondest memories, Kevin Burke played a tune that I was actually familiar with. I didn't know the name of it. I don't believe I had known the name of it, but I had heard it somewhere. And I was mystified as to what the name of the tune was. And suddenly he played that tune at the tail end of a set, in a set with a couple of other tunes. He took a break and I accosted him, and he came over to my table and we sat for a good 20 minutes chatting together. And I told him that I really admired that tune, and of course, he said, "Well, that's the Shoemaker's Daughter." And I said, "Wow." I said, "Do you have any idea where I can find the music for that?" He said, "Well, I'll tell you what. I'll just write it out for you here right now. Do you have a pencil?" Well, we acquired a pencil and a piece of paper. Kevin Burke literally wrote the tune out. He drew music staff lines, and he wrote out the Shoemaker's Daughter for me. I still have that piece of paper somewhere. It's a great tune. Fantastic tune. We had a few pints together, more than one occasion, sitting and talking. And the great Joe Burke, though, man. Joe had a presence and a manner about him on stage that was second to none. He was the king. He was the king. My friend Robert Freeman, who lives in Indiana now, we used to go to McGurk's a lot. And we used to marvel at the manner in which Joe Burke he'd have his accordion sitting in his lap, and he would just very casually and nonchalantly proceed to tell a story or a series of stories about the next set of tunes they were going to play, and he would be holding his beer. There was just something about the way that he would hold his beer that it used to just make us go crazy. It's a hard thing to explain, but he just had a physical. He was a physical caricature of himself, and he was so marvelous with that great, big, crazy-ass, white-gray beard of his. Sometimes his face would turn a bit red, especially after a few pints. It never seemed to make any difference as far as his accordion playing was concerned. He was always right on the money, man. And then Anne would, I think there was a period of time where Anne was not in St. Louis, but then she did come to town, and they were often seen together on stage. It was sort of like accordion wars between Joe and Anne. And let me tell you something. Many times Joe would just introduce a set of tunes that Anne was going to play, and Joe would just sit. He would just sit there with his accordion in his lap and with his beer in his hand right out in front of him. And Anne would play solo a set of tunes. And I hate to say it, man, but as great as Joe was on the accordion, Anne was right there with him. I mean, she was right there. And marvelous instrumentalist, very high technical ability on the keyboard, and not to mention a very lovely looking woman, beautiful, quite frankly, uh, quite beautiful, captivating actually, and just as sweet as she could possibly be every time that I talked to her. She was marvelous. And so I have so many memories. I remember going over to, this was several years after Joe moved back to Ireland, after a very, I don't know how well known this story is, but I don't know all the details of it, but what I do know is that uh, Joe, who was booking Irish bands for McGurk's, uh, finally, at some point, got into some kind of a row with the management. And things, I think it also had to do with some pay that was due to himself and also his wife. And there were some ugly things said about Anne Conroy, Joe's wife, by the management, and they were trying to short her some of her pay, if I remember correctly. And uh, the long and the short of it is that Joe could not abide the insults, and it came to fisticuffs, and there were some punches thrown, and uh, that's about all I know about that incident. But what I do know is that the very next day, Joe and Ann were packing their bags up for Ireland. Needless to say, and and that was it. He moved back to Ireland. He was done with St. Louis for good. Uh, we were all sad to see him go. He also used to host an Irish music radio show on the local community station, which was KDHX. I recall it was every Monday morning. There was a period of time during the early 90s when I was doing outside sales work for the company that I worked for. I had a company car, and I was supposed to be driving around all over St. Louis, making cold calls on all these dumbass customers. And but I absolutely, utterly despised the job. Plus, I had also become, unfortunately, perhaps one could say, I had become a wee bit of a cocaine addict. That's right, you heard me right. I was doing a lot of cocaine back in those days, and I would drive out to a park on a Monday morning, and I would park in a sort of isolated spot with a nice view of a lake or some trees or something, and I would just turn on Joe Burke's radio show, which he called Ireland in America. And I would snort lines of cocaine while I listened to Joe carry on about all the various stories and experiences that he has had that surround many of the tunes that he would play from various and sundry Irish musicians. And some of his stories were so incredible that in some cases he would play some tunes of musicians that had passed away whom he remembered. And I'll never forget the one last Ireland in America radio show that he did. After all of this ugly stuff went down at McGurk's, and he was preparing to move away, and he hosted one last radio show of Ireland in America. And I remember sitting in a park And I listened to every word of that show and every word of his farewell to St. Louis. And there were tears rolling down my face. Many tears. As there are again today, having learned of his passing. Another one of my fondest memories of Joe's, in '95, my wife at the time and I went to Ireland for the Fleadh, which was being held in the town of Clonmel, somewhere in the central part of Ireland. In Clonmel, and we were told by, we were friends with Michael Piper Cooney, and he had, we had been having great difficulty finding accommodations in Clonmel or even near Clonmel. and Michael said, "Oh, Jesus, Mark. Jesus, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it for you. I'll take care of it for you. I'll find you something. Don't worry." And God damn if he didn't. Michael Cooney found us accommodations with a retired old Irish nun. I kid you not. I will never forget this woman for the rest of my life. The great Monica Breen. Monica Breen. She lived in a row house. A very funky 2-story row house. Skinny little row house. That probably dated back to the 1800s. She put up my wife and I up on the second floor in an old feather. I am not exaggerating. We were sleeping in a feather bed on one of those old time, early spring-loaded. It wasn't even a mattress. It was just a spring-loaded structure that was underneath the feather bed, and it was as old-timey as anything you could ever imagine. Michael Cooney somehow found us that accommodation, and I'll never forget it as long as I live, because Monica Breen, you see, she taught as a nun. She taught in Catholic school here in America for her whole career, up until I think she was in her maybe 50s, if I remember the story right. Something happened that caused great and serious and severe disillusionment between her and the church, and she ended up literally leaving the church, quitting, leaving the nunnery, or so to speak, or leaving the order of nuns, and cut out on her own and moved back to Ireland. And she was a devotee of Padre Pio, the South American saint, modern saint, who he was so high, spiritually and transcendentally high, that he his hands would exhibit the what do they call it? He would bleed either from the palms of his hands or from his wrists, literally bleed real blood, just like Jesus did when he was on the cross. The stigmata, that's what it's called. When he'd be in an extremely exalted state, he would start to experience the stigmata and be bleeding from his hands. Very high saint in the Catholic Church. He was from South America somewhere. I don't remember exactly where, but Monica Breen was a devotee of Padre Pio. She gave us some literature about him when we were staying with her, and she had a marvelous photo of him on the wall. She also told us about a very special place that nobody would normally know about, but it was a wild private spring water coming out of a rock somewhere out in the country, and she directed us as to how to get there. And the water was a very, very sacred site in Ireland, extremely sacred. Once you got to the premises, after you parked, you were not allowed to talk, not allowed to speak anywhere near the spring, but you could go in, and you were allowed to collect some water from the spring in a container, but no speaking. And then there were some old funky benches where you could sit and just meditate and be quiet, and we did exactly that. Incredible. Monica Breen herself God rest her soul. I can't imagine she would still be alive. If she's still alive, she would be close to 100 years old, I suspect. But I rather doubt that she's made it this far. There's only been a couple of people that I've ever met in my life. One or two, maybe three, whose physical presence was so powerful that you would just immediately be blissed out just being around this person. It's the same experience that so many of the American hippies, when they would travel to India, and along with Ram Dass, otherwise known as Dr. Richard Alpert, Ram Dass and some of the American hippies that found their way to Ram Dass's guru, who is known as Neem Karoli Baba. He usually hung out up in northern India in the mountains, in the foothills of the Himalayas. Just being in his presence, it is said, would completely bliss you out. The same phenomenon occurred routinely around Ramana Maharshi, the great Indian saint of South India. And of course, Ramana lived on the flanks of a mountain called Arunachala, which is down in near a town, an extremely ancient town in southern India called Tiruvannamalai. But Ramana Maharshi had that same palpable presence that just emanated out for tens of feet. Anybody sitting almost within eyeshot of Ramana would be enveloped in this, just a force field of love so strong. And the same thing would happen with Neem Karoli Baba, as has been so often described by Ram Dass and others. Monica Breen had the same quality. She was extremely devout. She was so transformed spiritually. I remember one morning when she was making breakfast for my wife and I. She insisted on making us breakfast every morning. She would very methodically and slowly and carefully brew a pot of tea, and she had this wonderful kettle or teapot that had a little cozy like a little blanket cozy thing that was made for it that would wrap all the way around it. She'd pour the hot boiling water into it and throw in the tea, and everything was very carefully and methodically done in her tiny, tiny little kitchen. And she had a little stoop that went out to the outside, and there were feral cats that she used to feed. Anything left over from the morning breakfast, she would just toss it out for the cats, and these cats would leap over the rooftops of the row houses all around and come traveling over, and awesome. But I remember that one morning as she prepared us breakfast. Some blood sausage, some kind of toast, some kind of eggs. It was, I went into an altered state. I remember it clearly. I was literally transported just watching her prepare us breakfast. I was completely stoned on my ass. Stoned on her love and her physical emanations. God bless her. God bless her. Monica Breen. So we continued on with all of our shenanigans having to do with the Fleadh, all the music competitions, and we were directed by Cooney and Joe Burke and that whole gang to go hang out at the Hayes Hotel, which was a little 4-story building, an old-time building, quite old structure with a lot of hotel rooms in it. But there was like a banquet hall down on the ground floor where there was going to be a big bunch of shenanigans going on, including Joe Burke, Ann Conroy, and Michael Cooney opening the show with a set of traditional tunes, and then there was going to be a what we used to call a trad rock Irish band. There are these Irish bands that would mostly youngsters playing not necessarily all traditional music by any means, but strangely enough, a lot of their material would in fact be various traditional Irish tunes, but all jacked up with electric bass, drums, sometimes a keyboard of some sort, and of course, if there was a fiddle player, they'd be plugged in. Very loud, raucous, and hard driving, just heart pounding. Trad rock music, and of course the dance floor would be full from one end to the other. We had a great night that night. I mean to tell you, it was so unbelievable. Let me see how long I've been going here. All right, I've got one more story to share. Actually, let me not fail to mention that earlier that same day, we had spent a couple of hours in the Hayes Hotel bar. It was my wife and I. I don't know if Cooney was there, but Joe and his wife Ann were there. And we sat around drinking shots of whiskey for a couple of hours during the afternoon and chatting and carrying on. And Joe said he had a bunch of fiddles back at the farm. And I had actually been considering making plans to route ourselves over in his direction and look at some of his fiddles. But that did not happen. But I spent a great afternoon chatting with Joe and getting plastered with him. What a marvelous man. What a cool dude. Absolutely cool dude. The great Joe Burke. The great Joe Burke. I've got images of him passing through my memory, almost like watching a video from those nights when I would watch him play at McGurk's. I can just still see the way he would move, how his right hand would dance over the keys on the accordion. What a player! What a musician! A great whistle player too. He could really whip off some awesome tunes on the whistles. Well, Joe, we're all going to be following you in due time. In due time, one after another, we'll all be following right behind you, brother. All right, enough said. God bless every one of you out there. From the bottom of my heart, God bless all of you. Take care.